beneath the ancient stone arches of Windsor Castle, where history is not remembered but felt, a ceremony unfolds that has outlived empires. Today, the world will see a spectacle of crimson robes, medieval plumes, and flawless smiles. But this is not a postcard come to life. This is a delicate, high-stakes ballet where every step is weighed down by centuries of tradition. Every glance is analyzed by a watching world, and the true story is written not in the order of service, but in the quiet moments the cameras never capture. A shared look of weary understanding, a gloved hand subtly steadying another, the silent weight of a crown that is both an heirloom and a prison. This is the day the royals grace the Order of the Garter, a display of timeless pomp where the most powerful performance is the one of unity itself. The morning mist clung to the Thames Valley as Windsor Castle emerged from the haze, a gray silhouette against a brightening sky. Within the private apartments, the day began not with fanfare, but with a familiar, focused quiet. King Charles III stood at his window, looking down at the Long Walk. The ancient green sward, soon to be lined with crowds, was empty now, holding its breath. He could recite the day's script by heart, the investiture, the luncheon, the procession, the service. Yet, familiarity did not breed carelessness. It bred a profound sense of responsibility that sat physically on his shoulders. Each Garter Day was a link in a chain that stretched back to Edward III, a tangible thread connecting him to the monumental and often ghostly history of the monarchy he now embodied. His valet moved with silent efficiency, laying out the uniform. The dark blue velvet of the garter mantle, the black velvet cap with its white ostrich plume, the golden enamel star. Each piece was a symbol, a weight. He thought not of kings of old, but of his own father, Prince Philip. On these days, his crisp carriage, his occasionally raised eyebrow at the more arcane traditions. A faint smile touched the king's lips. He would channel that today, the unwavering dedication, tempered with a touch of humanity. Down the corridor, in a sunlit sitting room, Queen Camilla was a portrait of calm amidst a whirlwind of preparation. Her dress, a pale cream tailored coat, hung ready. Her focus was on the details, the positioning of her own garter star, the selection of a meaningful brooch, one that had belonged to the late queen, a nod of quiet continuity. Her role, she knew, was one of grounded support. She reviewed the guest list for the luncheon, her mind matching names with faces and potential conversational topics. A foreign dignitary with an interest in horticulture, she would steer the king his way. A nervous new knight's family? A warm, disarming smile from her would put them at ease. Her strength was in reading the room, in smoothing the unspoken edges. She heard the soft, determined footsteps of her husband approaching and looked up, her expression shifting from strategic planner to steadfast partner. "A good morning for it," she said, her voice warm. He nodded, the shared understanding passing between them without words. It was showtime. In a separate wing, the Prince and Princess of Wales were navigating a different kind of morning. In their kitchen at Adelaide Cottage, the atmosphere was a blend of the historic and the hilariously normal. Prince William, already in his morning suit trousers and shirt, was attempting to butter a piece of toast for his youngest son, Louis, while fielding a last-minute call from his private secretary about the order of procession. Princess Catherine, her hair in rollers, was simultaneously helping Charlotte choose hair ribbons, not the sparkly one for the service, Lottie, the velvet ones, and reviewing the final fittings for her elegant, mint green ensemble via a tablet propped against the juice jug. "Papa, you've got jam on your phone," Louis announced cheerfully. William looked down, sighed with a laugh, and handed the toast over. This was the tightrope walk of their modern monarchy, to step from the messy, loving chaos of a family breakfast into the frozen pageantry of a 14th century order. Catherine caught William's eye over the head of their squabbling eldest, George. She gave him a small, private smile that said, "We're in this together." He returned it, the bond between them a solid anchor. Later, as they dressed in their formal attire, William in a mantle and regalia of a royal knight, Catherine in her elegant dress and dramatic wide-brimmed hat. The family noise faded, replaced by a shared, professional focus. They were no longer just parents. They were whales representing the future, their every public interaction a chapter in the story they were writing. Meanwhile, at Windsor, the machinery of the state was grinding into motion. Police in high-visibility jackets set up barriers along the castle walls. Television crews from Tokyo to Texas tested their shots of the horseshoe cloister. Yeoman warders, their red tunics vivid against the stone, checked the route. In the dean's office, the registrar of the order double-checked the medieval Latin on the service papers. In the Garter throne room, the mantles and insignia for the new appointees were laid out with reverence. The air crackled with a sense of impending theater. The public began to gather behind the barriers, clutching Union Jacks and picnic chairs, their excitement a palpable hum. They were there for the color, the fairy tale. They hoped for a wave, a smile, a clear photograph of a princess's hat. They understood the ceremony in its broadest strokes: royals, fancy clothes, old traditions. The deeper currents, the political nuances, the personal pressures, the immense historical burden, were invisible to them, hidden beneath velvet and protocol. The first act of the day was the private investiture of the new knights in the throne room. Here, away from the public gaze, the ritual felt even more potent. The king, now fully robed, took his seat before the Garter stall plates. The new knights, eminent figures from public service, the military, and politics, entered one by one, their usual confidence replaced by a schoolboy nervousness. The king performed each small ceremony with a measured grace. The presenting of the garter, the fastening of the mantle, the bestowing of the star and collar. His words of congratulation were personal, acknowledging each man's specific achievements. For a moment, with each knight, the formality softened into genuine human recognition. He knew he was not just rewarding them. He was binding them and their legacies to the crown, renewing an ancient contract of service. As the last knight bowed and withdrew, the king allowed himself a quiet breath. The foundation was laid. The stage was set. The castle, now buzzing with robed knights, their families, and officials, was ready to open its doors to the world. The timeless performance of continuity was about to begin. The clock tower over Windsor's Henry VIII gate struck noon, its chimes seeming to shake the very sunlight. Within the castle's state apartments, the atmosphere had transformed from preparatory quiet to a vibrant, low hum of conversation. The grand reception room was a sea of color and texture. The rich crimson of the knights' mantles, the glint of heavy golden collars, the soft blues and greens of ladies' silks and elaborate hats. It was a living tapestry. The new knights, now fully adorned, stood a little taller, the initial nervousness replaced by a dazed pride as they introduced their families. The air smelled of polished wood, starched linen, and the faint, sweet scent of the flower arrangements that stood as tall as children. King Charles and Queen Camilla moved through the room not as distant icons, but as hosts. This was a crucial part of the day's alchemy, turning a state function into something resembling a gathering. The king stopped by a former prime minister, now a companion of the order. Their conversation was brief, but intense, touching on a current international issue, a reminder that amidst the medievalism, contemporary governance quietly pulsed. A few steps away, Camilla engaged a new knight's wife, who was looking slightly overwhelmed. "Isn't the embroidery on the mantle exquisite?" Camilla said, gently touching the velvet. "It takes over 300 hours, I'm told." The comment was personal, tactile, grounding the grandeur in human craftsmanship. The woman's shoulders relaxed. This was Camilla's genius, the ability to demystify the mystery, to be a gracious, warm center in the formal whirl. Across the room, William and Catherine were fulfilling their own roles as the appealing, accessible face of the monarchy's future. William, chatting with a senior military knight, listened with the attentive focus he'd honed as an air ambulance pilot. Respectful, engaged, asking sharp questions. Catherine, a natural magnet, had drawn a small circle. She was talking with two teenage daughters of a new knight. They were fascinated by her hat. "It does make seeing sideways a bit of a sport," she confessed with a laugh, turning her head to demonstrate, and the girls giggled, any residual awe dissolving. This was their unspoken strategy. William, the earnest heir, solid and reliable. Catherine, the relatable princess, blending glamour with approachability. Together, they were a powerful engine of modern public relations, but in moments like these, the performance felt less like duty and more like a genuine desire to connect. Soon the summons came. It was time for the luncheon in the Waterloo chamber. The long table, gleaming with gilt and crystal, was set beneath monumental portraits of the Allies who defeated Napoleon. The juxtaposition was striking. The ghosts of martial triumph looking down on a scene of peaceful, civil splendor. Seating was a meticulous puzzle of precedence and diplomacy. The king presided at the head, with the most senior knights and foreign guests of honor nearby. Conversation was a soft roar, punctuated by the clink of cutlery on fine china. Speeches were made, short, witty, laden with historical allusion. The king's toast to the new companions was perfectly pitched, honoring tradition while sounding a note of forward-looking service. As the strawberry fool was served, a shaft of sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing above the table. For a suspended hour, history felt not like a burden, but a proud inheritance being gracefully shared. But outside the castle walls, another world was stirring. The crowds along the long walk and in the town had swelled into the thousands. The mood was festive, a giant street party under the June sun. Ice cream vendors did a brisk trade. Children sat on shoulders, waving small flags. A group of students from France debated the origins of the order. "C'est un histoire de jams, non?" one joked, referencing the apocryphal tale of a fallen lady's garter. For them, it was a spectacle, a living museum piece. For the elderly couple who came every year, it was a cherished fixture, as reliable as the seasons. They pointed out the best spots for viewing, sharing tips with first-timers. The police moved through the crowds, watchful but relaxed part of the scenery. The air was thick with anticipation, a collective waiting for the first glimpse of plumes and coaches. Back in the Waterloo chamber, the final glasses of water were sipped. A knowing look passed between the king and his equerry. The most public, most precarious part of the day was at hand. The procession. The royals and knights began to make their way through the castle's labyrinthine corridors towards the grand entrance. Here, in the cool, dim stone passageways, the last-minute adjustments were made. A page straightened a knight's collar. A lady-in-waiting handed Catherine a fresh pair of gloves. William shared a quiet word with his father. "All set?" he asked. The king gave a single, firm nod, his expression one of deep, focused resolve. The doors to the outside world stood before them, a barrier between the controlled privacy of the castle and the roaring, lens-filled public sphere. The ancient ritual was about to meet the modern crowd. The silence in the passage was absolute, heavy with the weight of centuries. Then, at a silent signal, the great oak doors began to swing open, and the sound of the waiting multitude rushed in like a wave, a roar of cheers, camera shutters, and distant band music. The performance, in its most exposed and dazzling form, had begun. A wall of sound and sunlight hit them as they emerged onto the dais at the top of the steps. The cheers from the crowd packed along the lower ward were a physical force. King Charles, now the sovereign of the order, led the way, his pace measured and stately. Behind him, Queen Camilla, her smile warm and constant. Then, William and Catherine, their public faces perfectly in place. William offering respectful nods, Catherine's gaze sweeping the crowd with a practiced, inclusive grace. The knights followed in pairs, a slow-moving river of crimson and white plumes. The contrast between the intimate luncheon and this blast of public adoration was jarring. Yet each member of the royal family made the transition seamlessly. It was a skill etched into their bones. The procession route from the state apartments to St. George's Chapel was less than 500 yards, but it was a journey through time and scrutiny. They moved through the narrow, cobbled passages of the upper ward, past the curfew tower, the crowds held back by nothing more than a rope and the respectful presence of the household cavalry. Here, the intimacy was startling. The royals were close enough to see individual faces. The beaming elderly woman with tears in her eyes, the young boy holding a welcome home Wills and Kate sign, the tourists from abroad with their phones held aloft. Catherine's hand, clad in white leather, would rise in a delicate wave, her eyes locking with someone in the crowd for a fleeting second, creating a personal memory they would carry forever. William would occasionally point to a child or mouth a thank you to a veteran in a beret standing to attention. These were not random gestures. They were the small, human stitches in the grand tapestry of the day, reinforcing the connection between the institution and the people. For King Charles, this walk was layered with decades of memory. He knew every flagstone, every arch. He recalled processing beside his mother, a young boy in a page's uniform, dwarfed by the robes. He remembered his father's stern, proud profile on this same path. Now he was the figure at the head, the cynosure. His gaze was ahead, but he absorbed the energy of the crowd, using it as fuel. He knew the cameras were capturing every micro-expression, the set of his jaw, the slight tightening around his eyes when a shout from the crowd pierced the air. The weight of the mantle was not just physical. It was the weight of expectation. He carried it back straight, projecting an image of serene, timeless authority. Beside him, Camilla's role was to soften that majesty. She turned her head more, her smiles broader, her waves more frequent. She was the accessible counterpart to his regal distance, a balance they had perfected over years. As they turned the final corner, the west front of St. George's Chapel rose before them, its Gothic stonework a breathtaking sight against the blue sky. The Knights of the Garter, who had been processing ahead, were now filing through the great doors. The music of the military band swelled, then faded, replaced by the solemn tolling of the chapel bell. The atmosphere shifted instantly from carnival to sacred ceremony. The royals paused at the threshold. This was the heart of the matter. The public spectacle was over. The ancient, sacred rite was about to begin. For a second, the king's eyes met William's. It was a look that bypassed father and son, passing directly from monarch to heir, a transfer of focus, a shared acknowledgement of the profound step they were about to take. Then, squaring his shoulders under the heavy velvet, King Charles III stepped across the threshold and into the cool, dim, incense-scented air of the chapel, leaving the noise of the 21st century behind. Inside, it was another universe. The roar of the crowd was muffled to a distant murmur, like the sound of the sea heard from a cave. The vast space was filled with a soft, colored light filtering through the stained glass windows, illuminating the famed fan-vaulted ceiling that hung like stone lace. The choir, where the ceremony would take place, was a blaze of heraldic color. Each knight has a dedicated stall, above which hung their banner, crest, and sword. The effect was overwhelming, a physical manifestation of history, lineage, and martial honor. The royals took their places in the sovereign stalls. The service, conducted by the Dean of Windsor and the Archbishop of Canterbury, was a masterpiece of Anglican liturgy and medieval tradition. The Latin prayers, the singing of the Garter hymn, Honi soit mal y pense, shame on him who thinks evil of it, the slow, precise movements of the officers of the order. It was a ritual unchanged in its essentials for centuries. For the participants, it was a moment of deep introspection. The king, reading the first lesson, his voice resonant in the hushed chapel, was not just a man performing a duty. In that space, he became the latest in an unbroken line of sovereigns, his voice blending with the echoes of all those who had spoken the same word from the same book in the same place. It was a moment of intense, almost mystical identification with the crown. William and Catherine, in their own stalls, participated with visible reverence. For William, this was part of his deepening education. He followed the intricate choreography, when to stand, when to sit, how to wear the cap and plume. He watched his father intently, studying not just the monarch, but the man navigating this spiritual and symbolic labyrinth. Catherine, her face framed by her hat, watched the ceremony with an artist's eye, appreciating the color, the movement, the sheer theater of it. But she also felt its gravity. This was not just a show. It was the bedrock of the institution she had married into. The ancient stones seemed to whisper of duty, sacrifice, and endurance. As the organ thundered and the choir's voices soared towards the ceiling, a sense of profound peace settled over the chapel. The external pressures, the media scrutiny, the political challenges, all were held at bay by the ancient walls. Here, for 1 hour, history was not a weight, but a shelter. The service drew to a close with a national anthem, sung with a fervor that vibrated in the chest. As the final note faded, there was a profound silence. The ritual was complete. The link to the past had been reforged. Now, they had to step back out into the modern world, carrying that ancient spirit with them. The great west doors of St. George's Chapel swung open once more, releasing the organ's final chords into the afternoon air. The transition was abrupt, from the hushed, sacred gloom to the bustling, sun-drenched world of the lower ward. The crowd, which had waited patiently, erupted anew, their cheers warmer now, touched by the shared solemnity they had sensed emanating from the ancient building. The royal family emerged, blinking slightly in the light, their expressions softer, less performative than before the service. The spiritual replenishment of the ceremony was visible in their ease. The return procession was a more relaxed affair. The pinnacle of the day's tension had passed. The king's step seemed lighter, his nods to the crowd more frequent. He shared a brief, smiling comment with Camilla, who laughed in response, a genuine, unguarded sound that carried to the nearest onlookers. This was the reward, the successful completion of the core duty. William and Catherine followed, their hands occasionally brushing as they walked. William pointed out something in the crowd to George and Charlotte, who had joined the procession for the return walk, their young faces serious with the import of the occasion. Little Louis, held by a nanny further back, waved a small flag with enthusiastic abandon, a charming note of childish spontaneity in the formal parade. These glimpses of the family unit, interwoven with the pageantry, were gold dust for the public and the watching media, a powerful narrative of tradition and future continuity and relatable humanity. But the day was not yet over. The public departed, the barriers were dismantled, and the television satellite trucks packed up their gear. Within the castle walls, however, a final, entirely private act remained. The royal family, still in their magnificent robes, gathered for a series of official photographs in the green drawing room. The setting was opulent, with priceless artworks as a backdrop, yet the mood was surprisingly light. The professional photographer, a trusted figure, worked quickly to capture the required formal shots. The king with the knights of the royal family, the full group, the Wales family alone. Right, just one more of you all looking this way. Wonderful, the photographer said. As the flash popped, Prince Louis, now freed, made a silly face behind his sister. Charlotte elbowed him gently, trying not to grin. The adults caught the exchange, and a ripple of suppressed laughter ran through the group. The photographer, sharp-eyed, captured that moment too, the flawless facade cracking to reveal the warm, messy reality beneath. It would not be released to the public, but it would become a cherished private memory. With the photographs done, the weighty regalia was carefully removed. Mantles were laid in tissue paper in their special boxes, collars, and stars locked away in velvet-lined cases. The transformation back from royal icons to individuals was almost physical. In his private sitting room, King Charles changed into a comfortable tweed jacket. He stood again at the window. The long walk was empty now, littered with the confetti of a day's celebration. The silence was a relief. He felt the familiar post-ceremony mix of exhaustion and deep satisfaction. A job well done. A tradition annule. The monarchy, for another year, had performed its ancient, symbolic dance without a misstep. He thought of the new knights, bound now to the order, and of his family, who had played their parts so flawlessly. The institution was safe in their hands. Down in Adelaide Cottage, the Wales family had returned to a different reality. The elegant mint green dress was hung away, the impressive hat placed in its box. Catherine, now in jeans and a sweater, helped a tired Lewis into his pajamas. William was in the kitchen, making tea and fielding a final call from his team. "Yes, the coverage seems overwhelmingly positive," he said, leaning against the counter. He listened, nodding. "Good. Thank everyone for me. It was a real team effort." He hung up and brought 2 mugs into the living room, handing one to Catherine. They sank onto the sofa together, a quiet space opening between them after the day's relentless togetherness. No words were needed. The television was off. The only sound was the settling of the old house and the distant echo of the day's fanfare, now just a memory in the tranquil Berkshire air. Back at the castle, a final, small gathering took place. The king, queen, and a few senior members of the royal household had a quiet drink in a small parlor. The talk was not of statecraft, but of the day's small moments. The nervous new knight who'd nearly put his mantle on backwards, the beautiful singing of the choir, the perfect weather. It was a debrief, but a familial one. The queen recounted her conversation with the French dignitary about roses. The king mentioned the veteran he'd seen in the crowd. These were the human stories that, for them, formed the true texture of the day, far removed from the symbolic weight of the ceremony. They were the proof that the institution they served was, at its heart, about people. As dusk fell over Windsor Great Park, casting long shadows from the round tower, the castle returned to its eternal quiet. The last staff members departed. The lights in the private apartments glowed softly. The Order of the Garter event was over for another year. The world had seen what it was meant to see: an unbroken line, a flawless performance, a fairy tale in crimson and gold. But the real story, as always, had happened in the margins, in the shared looks, the private laughs, the weary sighs at the end of a long day, and the steadfast commitment that carried a family and an institution from one link in the chain of history to the next. The grace they had shown was not just in their public presence, but in the quiet, enduring strength that made that presence possible. The performance was complete, but the duty, like the ancient stones of Windsor itself, was everlasting. The morning after the Garter ceremony was always a quiet one. The castle seemed to be resting after its grand performance. The flag still flew high, but the crowds were gone. The only sounds were the normal ones of birds in the garden and the distant hum of a lawnmower on the castle grounds. King Charles was in his study much later than usual. He was not a man who slept in, but he had allowed himself a slower start. The previous day was like a long and complex piece of music he had conducted. Now, he felt the pleasant tiredness that comes after a job done well. He sat at his desk, not to work, but to think. Sunlight came through the window and fell on a simple wooden box on his desk. He opened it. Inside were not jewels or documents, but small personal things. A worn leather bookmark from his father, a pressed flower from his mother's garden, a drawing from a grandchild. These were the things that reminded him of the people behind the crowns. The ceremony yesterday was about the crown. This morning was about the man who wore it. He thought about the new knights. He had welcomed them into an ancient club, but he hoped he had also welcomed them as friends. The monarchy he wanted was not a cold monument. It was a living thing built on real connections. He picked up a pen and wrote a few short notes by hand to some of the knights. Just a line or two to say it was good to see them yesterday. This small act was important to him. It was a human touch after a day of grand symbols. Queen Camilla was in her own sitting room surrounded by newspapers. She read the coverage of the event with a practical eye. The photos were mostly good. The stories were positive. She was pleased to see a nice one of Catherine talking to those young girls. She made a mental note to tell her. Camilla knew the power of these small moments. They were the stories people remembered more than the robes. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from one of her charities. They were asking about a visit next week. She smiled. This was the real work. The ceremony was one day. The work of supporting people was every day. She got up and walked to the window. Down below, she could see the gardens. She thought about the garden parties they would have here soon. Those events were less formal than the Garter, but just as important. They were a chance to meet people from all walks of life, to hear their stories, to say thank you. She believed in this simple idea, that to be a good monarch, you had to be a good listener. Yesterday, they had been listened to. Today, it was their turn to listen again. At Adelaide Cottage, the day began with much more noise. Prince Louis was full of energy. He was pretending to be a knight marching around the kitchen. He had a wooden spoon for a sword and a colander on his head for a helmet. Princess Charlotte was trying to read a book, but laughing at her brother. Prince George was helping his father make pancakes. It was a normal family breakfast, but the memory of yesterday hung in the air. "So what did you think of it all?" George William asked as he flipped a pancake. "It was long," George said honestly. "But the horses were cool, and grandfather looked very serious." "He has a very serious job," William said. "But, you know, he is not always serious. Remember when he helped us build that bug hotel in the garden?" George smiled. "Yeah, he got dirt on his trousers." "Exactly," William said. "The robes and the ceremonies are one part, but the person is another. You will learn both in time." Catherine came in carrying a basket of laundry. She heard the end of the conversation. She put the basket down and gave William a look. It was a look that said, "Not too heavy for a Saturday morning." She understood the need to prepare George, but she also fought for his childhood. "Who wants strawberries on their pancakes?" she asked, brightly changing the subject. The children all shouted me later that morning. William and Catherine sat with cups of coffee in their small garden. The children were playing on the grass. The piece was a sharp contrast to the crowds of yesterday. "You were wonderful yesterday," Catherine said quietly. "You always are." William reached over and took her hand. "We both were. That bit with the girls and the hat. Pura genius." Catherine laughed. "It was true. I could barely see them. But they will remember it forever," William said. "That is the thing. We are creating memories for people. Good memories, we hope." He sighed and looked at his children. "I thought a lot about Father during the service, about the weight he carries. One day there will be me. I watched him yesterday, how he moves through it all, the public bits and the private bits. It is a lifetime of training. And you're trained too," Catherine said, squeezing his hand. "You have been preparing for this since you were born. But you would do it your own way. Our way, with the children close, with a more open kind of monarchy." William nodded. He hoped she was right. He wanted a monarchy that felt connected and useful, not just historic. The Garter ceremony was important. It was the backbone of tradition. But he believed the flesh and blood of the monarchy was in the visits to food banks and schools and mental health charities. It was in talking to young people about their struggles. It was in showing that it is okay to not be okay. Yesterday was about the crown. Today and all the other days were about the people who would one day live under that crown. Meanwhile, in another part of Windsor Castle, a very different meeting was taking place. The senior events team and the master of the household were having what they called the post-mortem. It was not a sad meeting. It was a practical one. They sat around a table with notebooks and laptops. The procession timing was perfect, one said. The delay at the Henry VIII gate was exactly 45 seconds, which is what we planned for the media shots. The sound system in the chapel quad worked well this year, another added. No feedback. The flowers in the Waterloo chamber were a bit high, the housekeeper noted. Lady, so could not see the speaker from her seat. We will note that for next year. They went through every detail. The food, the security, the transportation of the robes, the weather plan. It was a vast and complex operation that had run as smoothly as a Swiss watch. But that smoothness was the result of relentless planning and years of experience. These people were the invisible engine of the monarchy. They never appear in the photos, but they made the photos possible. Their pride was in a day with no mistakes. A day where the royal family could focus on their role without worrying about a loose cobblestone or a missing button. Back in his study, King Charles finished his notes. He then turned to a box of letters. His staff filtered his mail, but He always read a sample of the letters from the public himself. He believed it was a vital link. He opened one. It was from an elderly man in Scotland. He wrote that he had watched the ceremony on television with his wife. His wife had Alzheimer's and did not remember much anymore. But she had seen the bright robes and the horses, and she had smiled. She had said how pretty it was. The man wrote to thank the king for giving his wife a moment of simple joy. Charles put the letter down. He felt a lump in his throat. This was it. This was the reason for it all. The billions of people who saw the ceremony saw a grand historical event. But for this one man and his wife, it was a moment of peace and beauty in a difficult life. That was the true power of the symbol. It can mean something different to everyone. For some it was history. For some it was duty. For some it was just a splash of color on a difficult day. He picked up his pen again and wrote a short reply to the man. He told him he was moved by his letter and that he and the queen were thinking of him and his wife. He wished them peace. It was a small act, but it made the institution human. As lunchtime approached, the royal family's separate, quiet mornings began to come together. A simple plan was made. The king and queen would drive the short distance from the castle to Adelaide Cottage. They would have a casual lunch with William and Catherine and the children. No staff, no chiefs, just family. When the car pulled up, Louis was the first to the door. "Grandfather, grandmother," he shouted. "Hello, my boy," Charles said, bending down to hug him. "Did you recover from your marching yesterday?" Louis nodded vigorously. "I'm still marching, see." He stomped his feet. Camilla hugged Catherine. "You looked absolutely beautiful yesterday, my dear. That color was perfect." "Thank you," Catherine said. "It was such a wonderful day. Everything went so smoothly." They went inside. The table was set with simple plates. There was a big salad, some cold chicken, and bread. William was in charge of pouring the water. George and Charlotte helped carry things to the table. It was normal family chaos. But for this family, these normal moments were the most precious things in the world. Over lunch, the talk was not about ceremony or duty. It was about other things. Charles talked about a new tree he had planted in the garden. Camilla talked about a book she was reading. Catherine talked about a school project Charlotte was doing. William teased George about his football team. They talked about summer holidays. They laughed. For an hour, the crowns were completely off. They were just grandparents, parents, and children. After lunch, the children wanted to show them the garden. They went outside. George showed his grandfather the vegetable patch he was tending. Charles knelt down in his trousers to look at the young lettuce plants. He gave George advice about slugs. William watched them from a distance. He saw his father, the king, with dirt on his fingers, talking intently to his son. This was the balance. This was the secret. You had to be able to wear the robe and then take it off and kneel in the garden. You had to be both, the symbol and the man. Later, as the afternoon sun began to soften, Charles and Camilla prepared to leave. Goodbyes were said at the door. Promises were made to see each other soon. As they drove back to the castle, Charles was quiet. Camilla looked at him. "Tired?" she asked. "A little," he said, "but a good tired. It is important to have those times. Just us." "Very important," Camilla agreed. "It reminds us why we do all this." That evening, as the sun set over Windsor, the castle was quiet once more. In his study, Charles turned on the television for the evening news. The lead story was about politics. The second story was about the economy. Then, halfway through the broadcast, they showed a recap of the Order of the Garter. There were the beautiful shots of the procession, the close-up of the robes, the smiling faces of the crowd. The newsreader spoke of tradition and continuity. It was a 2-minute piece. Then, the news moved on to a sports story. Charles smiled. That was the nature of it. A year of planning. A lifetime of preparation. A day of immense pressure and focus. And it became a 2-minute story on the news. But he knew that 2 minutes mattered. In a world that changed so fast, those 2 minutes of color and tradition were an anchor for many people. They were a reminder of something stable and enduring. They were a part of the nation's story. He turned off the television. The room was silent. He looked at the portrait of his mother on the wall. She was in her garter robes too. He felt a connection that went beyond words. He was now the one leading the ceremony. He was the one carrying the weight. But he did not carry it alone. He had Camilla by his side. He had William and Catherine and the next generation coming up behind. He had a family and a household and a nation. The Garter event was over. But the work of monarchy was never over. It was a constant thread in the fabric of the country. Tomorrow there would be meetings with ambassadors. There would be awards to present. There would be more letters to read and people meet. The cycle continued. But for tonight, there was peace. He had done his duty. He had honored the past. And he had spent time with the future. That was enough. He turned out the light and went to join his wife. Another day was done. The castle slept under the stars, its flags still flying quietly in the dark. A symbol of history. A home for a family. A constant in a changing world.